Good morning. I want to thank everybody for being here. You guys are the real stalwarts of the American presidency and capitalism, so I appreciate you coming out this early in the morning. But never fear, we have three panels, and today, not to disappoint you. So if you don't hear something this morning that's interesting, you'll come back in the afternoon, and we'll sure to please you. In any case, I want to thank our panelists and our entire group for being here today. It's just a great pleasure, great honor to have these folks here on our campus and to be doing something we think is very important to not only what we do as historians, but what we do for the profession in advancing the knowledge of the American presidency through forums like this. So we really do appreciate you being here and being a part of this. And I'm absolutely delighted for those people who have, on our own faculty, have contributed to being a part of this symposium as well. Before I introduce this morning's chair, I just want to say that there will be a question and answer session following each panel. So after the final panelist this morning, there will be a Q&A, and our chair of this session will moderate that Q&A. So please take notes, and if you have questions, that's the time to ask them. Moderating this morning's session will be our own Dr. Evan Bennett. He's an associate professor here at Florida Atlantic University. He's a terrific scholar of labor and environmental history, as well as Florida and Southern history. He's the author-editor of 2 books, and his most recent work, When Tobacco Was King, has received many accolades, and he is an absolute terrific scholar to have on our faculty here. And we're delighted that he is chairing this session this morning. So, Evan, I welcome you to the podium. Thank you very much.
Good morning and welcome to our panel, which is titled simply Patterns. And we have 4 excellent scholars that I'll introduce for you here in a moment. I went to a university that had a bad basketball program, and I remember when we would be on TV, they'd tell people to move forward so we looked like we were full. If you want to see better or anything, I don't know that we'll have a problem if you want to move forward during the talks. Our first speaker this morning is Professor Mark Wilson. He'll be speaking Presidents, the Military-Industrial Complex, and the Ascendant Politics of Free Enterprise. Professor Wilson is Associate Professor of History at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He is the author of the books The Business of Civil War, which came out from Johns Hopkins University Press in 2006, and Destructive Creation, American Business, and the Winning of World War II, which comes out this year with the University of Pennsylvania Press. Our second speaker will be Professor Ewan Morgan, who will be speaking Fiscal Bounty, Presidents, the Federal Budget, and Economic Good. Professor Morgan is Commonwealth Fund Professor of American History at University College London in the United Kingdom. His books include Eisenhower versus the Spenders, the Eisenhower Administration, the Democrats, and the Budget, 1953 to 1960, which came out from St. Martin's Press in 1990, excuse me, and The Age of Deficits, Presidents and Unbalanced Budgets from Jimmy Carter to George W. Bush, which came out from the University Press of Kansas in 2009. It was the winner of the 2010 Richard Neustadt Book Prize of the American Politics Group. And he's currently finishing up, or has finished, a biography of Reagan, which will be published later this year. Our third speaker is Brent Siebel. He'll be speaking The Anti-Government Impulse, the Presidency, and the Splintering of the Public Good. Brent Siebel is the Mellon postdoctoral research scholar in the Digital Scholarship Lab at the University of Richmond. In 2014-2015, he was a postdoctoral visiting scholar at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He received his PhD in U.S. history from the University of Virginia, which is a College of William & Mary graduate. I'll have to deal with that. And he received it from the University of Virginia in 2014, where he was also a Miller Center Dissertation Fellow. He continues to serve as an Associate Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture, where he's the project investigator for the Thriving Cities Project and serves as the Associate Director of the Program on Culture, Capitalism, and Global Change. He's completing his first book, which will come out with the University of Pennsylvania Press, which he says is very tentatively titled, The American Way of Growth, Business, Poverty, and Development in the American Century. And our last speaker will be Professor Elizabeth Tandy Shermer, who will be speaking on American presidents and the American University. Professor Shermer is Assistant Professor of History at Loyola University Chicago. She's published opinion pieces, journal articles, book chapters, edited collections, and the monograph Sunbelt Capitalism, Phoenix, and the Transformation of American Politics, which came out from the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2015. She is currently writing on the financial underpinnings of higher education, a very important topic given where we are right now. I hope you'll give them all give them all your best attention and a warm welcome. We'll start with Professor Wilson.
Thank you. And before I start, let me thank Florida Atlantic University, the Larkin family, Mark Rose, Roger Biles, Stephen Engel, and Zella Lynn for all the work they've done to put together this great conference. And thanks to the audience for being with us here at 9 a.m. in the midst of this lively presidential primary season to talk about history. And I'd also like to thank my fellow presenters. It's a really great group of people. And as Professor Bala said yesterday, you're in for a real treat today. And first, you have to listen to me for 15 minutes. One of the most important parts of American capitalism since 1945, at least, has been the military-industrial sector. At the height of the Cold War, during the Eisenhower presidency, military spending accounted for close to 90% of federal government outlays, nearly 10% of GDP. Even today, when the military takes a smaller slice of the whole national economic pie in the huge service-oriented economy that Professor Bala described yesterday, even today, military spending stands at $600 billion a year. Major U.S. defense contractors like Boeing and Lockheed Martin rank among the nation's most important companies. So I propose to you the military-industrial sphere should loom large in any evaluation of American presidents and capitalism since 1945. However, when it comes to the question of how presidents have shaped the defense sector, easy answers can be elusive. Might, in fact, the defense sector be mostly outside the control of presidents? This was implied by President Eisenhower's 1961 farewell address, which introduced the phrase military-industrial complex into the national lexicon. And since 1961, many observers of the defense sector have described some version of an iron triangle, including three major elements: contractors, the Pentagon, and Congress. This triad notably does not include the White House. So, have presidents mattered? Today I'll suggest that presidents and their administrations, even if they've failed to fully control the military-industrial complex, have had some opportunities to influence it. And this shouldn't be too surprising, given what we know about presidents' pre-presidential careers. Since the early 1940s, many presidents, far from being naive pushovers when it came to the defense sector, have been true experts on its workings. These defense sector experts included not just Eisenhower, but Franklin Roosevelt, a former Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Harry Truman, the chair of the most important congressional committee investigating the World War II economy, and Jimmy Carter, who worked as a young Navy officer on the early nuclear submarine program. Several post-45 presidents have been military veterans and or hailed from states with big defense industries like California and Texas. Given this large roster of presidents with defense expertise, I propose that we consider the following question: which American president since 1945 was the most effective over the long run in influencing the shape of the military-industrial complex? The answer, of course, is Herbert Hoover. No joke. Since World War II, the American military-industrial complex has been reshaped in ways that accorded with the designs of Hoover. Hoover and his allies, who included many American business leaders, wanted to create a military-industrial sphere that would be far more privatized than the one they saw in the mid-20th century. Hoover, like other mid-20th century champions of free enterprise, wanted the burgeoning U.S. military-industrial complex to become less socialist and more capitalist. Hoover and his allies got their way. Here's the first point of my talk today. The military-industrial complex, contrary to the claims of many of its critics, has been neither impervious to reform nor apart from capitalism. Rather, since the 1950s, it's been substantially privatized, deregulated, even demilitarized. Although this hoovering of the military-industrial complex was championed during the early Cold War by a Republican ex-president, it quickly became a bipartisan project. And here's the second point I'll emphasize today. From 1960 through the end of the 20th century, it was during the tenure of Democratic presidents, not just Republican ones, that the hoovering of the U.S. military economy proceeded. Changes in party control of the White House did little to affect the long-run trend. And the third and final point I'll suggest over the next few minutes concerns presidential agency or power. Presidents, while far from being omnipotent, have had some opportunities to shape the military-industrial complex. And those chances have included their ability to appoint secretaries of defense, as well as their handling of a series of crises in the defense sector over the last several decades. In nearly all of these cases since the 1950s, I'll suggest, presidents and their teams have made choices that have promoted rather than limited the hoovering of the defense sector. So now let me elaborate very briefly on each of these 3 points. First, to the point about the transformation of the defense sector since 1945. In what sense was the military-industrial complex hoovered? To address this question, we need to know a little bit more about Hoover's vision. The Hoover vision that concerns us here was expressed most clearly not in the 1920s during Hoover's days as Secretary of Commerce and President, but during the late 1940s and early 50s when Hoover chaired 2 important commissions on government reorganization. This was a period during which Hoover, by then a fiercely anti-New Deal Republican, saw himself as engaged in what he called a crusade against collectivism as he battled what he regarded as creeping socialism. Hoover and his allies were greatly concerned about the defense establishment, which at the time was easily the biggest part of the national government. The Department of Defense contained hundreds of government-run enterprises ranging from small bakeries to major naval shipyards. According to Hoover and his allies, including many business leaders, the military's public enterprises were not merely inefficient, but also constituted what they called an alarming intrusion into a realm that needed to be set aside for private, for-profit firms. To what extent did Hoover and other champions of free enterprise succeed in remaking the military-industrial complex into the more privatized, more capitalist version they imagined? My answer is to a very great extent. Let's consider just a couple of measures of their success. In the field of naval shipbuilding, the U.S. Navy once made lots of its own warships in its own yards, not just in the 19th century, but from World War I through the early Cold War. But today, most of the Navy yards are completely gone. The Navy hasn't built a new warship in its own facilities for the past 50 years. There's a similar story in the small arms industry, in which the Army's own plants were once the world's leading designers and producers of rifles. In our day, that's not the case. In recent years, most of the military's needs have been filled only by for-profit contractors, such as Colt and General Dynamics, not a mixture of private and public enterprises, as had been the case for most of U.S. history before the 1960s. Over the last couple of decades, as many of you know, we've seen the rise of a new aspect of this trend, the rise of for-profit firms offering military muscle, such as Blackwater and Triple Canopy. These are spectacular examples, but we need to understand them as part of a late chapter in a much longer, larger story, which involved not just military manpower, but also weapons acquisition, logistics, and even welfare services. In all these fields over the past 6 decades, Hoover's dream has become reality. Now, let me turn to the second point about bipartisanship. One of the most remarkable aspects of the history of the hoovering of the defense sector is the extent to which it was advanced during the administrations of Democratic presidents as well as Republican ones. Indeed, it was during the mid-1960s that Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, a member of Kennedy's cabinet who stayed on under President Johnson, issued a series of orders that effectively killed the military's in-house capacities for the production of small arms and new warships. These steps towards privatization were as important, if not more so, than anything that had occurred during the Eisenhower years. This bipartisan effort in the direction of privatization continued after the Vietnam War from the early 1970s to the early 2000s. Here we might think of developments during Republican administrations, such as the dynamics of the Reagan defense buildup or George W. Bush's Iraq War, as well as the initiatives of Republican secretaries of defense, such as Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. However, we need to remember that the emphasis on privatization characterized the Clinton years as well. Indeed, as the historian Jennifer Middlestat has argued in her important recent book on the military welfare state, many DoD functions were privatized more thoroughly under Clinton than they had been under Reagan. Now, let me turn to my third and final point about presidential power. The record of relentless transformation in the defense sector over the past 6 or 7 decades might lead us to ask whether presidents had much influence over the process. And rightly so, I think, given that many of the reasons for the hoovering surely went beyond the White House. Among the most important of those reasons, it seems clear, were lobbying by contractors, Congress's addiction to military-industrial jobs, and Pentagon officials' responses to the problem of declining available manpower. All these were important. Still, I think we can see presidents not as impotent tools, but rather as active participants in the hoovering of the military-industrial complex. Presidents and their teams mattered in a variety of ways, and I'll just refer to 2 here. First, maybe most obviously, they chose top Pentagon officials. Presidents exerted influence via their choices of secretaries of defense and their deputies, who became the president's designated overseers of the defense sector. And here the record shows that presidents of both parties almost always selected men sympathetic to hoovering, even if they were not always among the nation's most outspoken champions of free enterprise. The longest-serving Republican secretaries of defense have tended to be corporate executives, conservative politicians, or some combination of the two. Here we may recall men such as Charles Wilson and Melvin Laird, and Laird's top deputy, David Packard, as well as Rumsfeld and Cheney. But Democratic presidents have also tended to select top defense officials friendly to hoovering. The typical Democratic Secretary of Defense in recent years has been more of a technocrat engineer, but not a New Dealer type, but instead a New Democrat type, enthusiastic about commercialization and outsourcing. Here we should remember especially McNamara and William Perry, both of whom were among the most important champions of the hoovering of the defense sector. As an aside, I'll add that an important exception is Harold Brown, President Carter's Secretary of Defense, and we can talk more about that later if you want. Beyond their powers to appoint, presidents have also had the chance to be influential in their handling of late 20th century defense sector crises, including the impending financial collapses of top contractors and well-publicized scandals. Here I have in mind events such as the Lockheed bailout of the early 1970s, the standoff between the Navy and its top shipbuilders in the later 1970s, in which essentially several big contractors threatened to shut down unless they were paid more, and the well-publicized waste, fraud, corruption, profiteering scandals of the 1980s. You may remember the $500 hammer stories and the like. During each of these crises, sitting presidents Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Reagan might have taken the opportunity to question or even limit or roll back the ongoing privatization of the defense sector. Instead, faced with these crises, they chose to do the opposite. They responded in ways that actually advanced the hoovering process. Okay, so to recap in this brief talk, I've just tried to suggest 3 points. First, there's been a long-run transformation of the U.S. military economy from the 1940s to the present day in the direction of privatization, deregulation, and the degradation of the military's in-house knowledge and capacities. To put it more simply, the American military-industrial complex became less socialist, more capitalist. Second, although this transformation was launched and dreamed of mainly by Republicans originally, such as Herbert Hoover, it turned out to be a bipartisan project promoted by politicians of both parties. And third, presidents do seem to have participated in the Hoovering, for example, in their choices of secretaries of defense and their responses to these crises. So let me just conclude with 2 questions. First, has it mattered, and should we care? That is, has the hoovering of the military-industrial complex had any significant effects on the cost and quality of national and global security? I'll throw that out there. Second, how have developments in the defense sector related, if at all, to happenings in the broader U.S. capitalist economy and presidents' engagements with economic policy more generally? I suspect we'll be better equipped to answer that second question about the bigger picture by the end of the day, when we've heard from the rest of the speakers. So let me stop there so we can hear from them. Thanks for listening.
Okay, well, let me add my thanks for everybody who's been involved in setting up and the running of this wonderful conference. I'm going to be speaking today on fiscal bounty, presidents, the federal budget, and economic good. And I just thought I would use that title because budget and economic good are not 2 terms that are normally thought of going together in recent years. My argument fundamentally is that presidents have been very important promoters and facilitators of American capitalism, but you rarely hear a president talking specifically about how his policies have benefited American capitalism. Usually, presidents talk about the fruits of American capitalism in terms of their broad-based nature, that they have helped American capitalism improve standards of living, maintain high employment, and also low inflation and strong economic growth. So there's a fundamental understanding then that government has facilitated private enterprises' capacity to deliver various economic goods in the form of higher standards of living, stronger growth, high employment, etc. Crucial in all this is legislation enacted in 1946, the Employment Act of 1946, which obliged government to promote maximum employment, production, and purchasing power. There was no specific mandate in that legislation that the president should be primarily responsible for this. But because the legislation created the Council of Economic Advisers within the executive office of the presidency to aid the president in the task of achieving the aims of the Employment Act, and bade the president issue an economic report annually to Congress, it was pretty clear that by implication the legislation intended the president to be the manager of prosperity. And I would argue there are 2 distinct periods of presidential economics. What can broadly be called the Keynesian era from 1946 to 1969, and the supply-side era from 1981 to 2008, with a transitional era in between when the presidents of that period manifested both Keynesian and supply-side tendencies. But time requires me to focus on the 2 main Keynesian era and supply-side periods. Here, of course, are the 4 Keynesian presidents, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson. And the Keynesian presidents used the federal budget as a principal instrument of economic management. Even though Congress held the ultimate power of the purse, presidents had the ability through the presidential budget plan and other instruments to set the agenda for congressional decision-making. And presidents, guided by their economic advisors, sought to manipulate budget outlays and revenue levels to promote these economic goods that I've mentioned. This was a highly successful strategy in the decade after World War II, helped, as Mark has indicated, by huge military outlays at the start of the Cold War. But in the late 1950s, the benefits of this massive infusion of military spending began to tail off somewhat. The benefits of consumerism began to slow somewhat. And in the late 1950s, Dwight D. Eisenhower was faced with the dilemma of whether to try to maximize economic growth or control inflation that was beginning to creep into the economy. And Eisenhower decided, primarily for Cold War purposes, that it was essential to defend the value of the dollar in order to sustain America's Cold War effort. And as a consequence, Eisenhower sacrificed the strong rates of economic growth that had characterized American economic development from about 1945 through to the mid-1950s. And this led to the 1960 election, where the Democrats, in the person of John F. Kennedy, fought the campaign on a promise of delivering 5% annual economic growth, encapsulated in Kennedy's famous statement of the need to get the country moving again. And in the 1960s, what emerged was a new type of Keynesian economics, called at the time the New Economics, and defined as Keynes cum growth by Walter Heller, chair of the Kennedy-Johnson Council of Economic Advisors. And the New Economics aimed to manage the economy to maximize economic growth, rather than to stabilize cyclical movements such as controlling recessionary trends or inflationary trends. Now the aim was to maximize growth rather than smooth out the economic cycle. And in many ways, the 1960s was the ultimate age of the economist. And Heller would write a memoir of his service primarily in the Kennedy administration, but he also served Lyndon Johnson for 1 year. And that book opens with a very dramatic statement. Economics has come of age in the 1960s. Two presidents have recognized and drawn on modern economics as a source of national strength and presidential power. But even as these words were being written, the age of the economist was coming to an end. Now, the New Economics in practice, its fundamental central policy was the tax cut enacted in 1964 under the Johnson presidency, but initiated and introduced into Congress by John F. Kennedy, but held up in Congress because this might be difficult for us to believe, but a conservative coalition of Republicans and Southern Democrats refused to cut taxes until the budget was in balance. It was at that time operating a small deficit. But Johnson, exploiting national remorse after Kennedy's assassination, made the enactment of the tax cut part of the Kennedy legacy that he was sworn to uphold. And as a consequence, the 1964 tax cut went through. It was one of the largest tax cuts to date in American history, and it fueled an economic boom. From 1964 to 1966, unemployment was down to 4%, effectively the full employment level. Inflation was a very, very low 2%. That was an acceptable trade-off to the new economists, and the economy did indeed grow by 5% a year, as Kennedy had envisaged in the 1960 election. But the trouble was, as soon as the economy was purring along nicely under the impact of the 1964 tax cut, the United States became involved in the Vietnam War. And the war put immense new pressures on an economy already operating virtually at full capacity. And as a consequence, the Vietnam War uncorked the bottle which held the genie of inflation, and inflation began to grow quite significantly in the second half of the 1960s, so that the new economists' hope of combining prosperity with price stability was shattered. Any hope that they could find a new formula for combining prosperity with price stability in the 1970s disappeared with the energy crises of that decade, the commodity price inflation, and very importantly, the fact that in 1971, the Bretton Woods agreement, whereby the dollar had a fixed value of gold, which had been established in 1944, was terminated, and a free-floating dollar in the global market became a contribution to inflation as the United States began to import more goods from abroad. And of course, as the dollar declined somewhat in value, consequently, that became problematic. This is a very brief chart, a very simple chart of inflation in the 1960s. Yes, there was high employment. Yes, there was strong growth. But the third element of the Trinity, low inflation, never came about. And you can see that black line, which is the headline inflation rate between demand inflation and supply inflation. Supply inflation is cost-push inflation. And that signaled both the policy and political demise of the new economics. With the dawn of the 1980s, we had a new cycle of presidential economics, which I have called here, for want of a better term, the supply-side presidencies. Ronald Reagan with Congressman Jack Kemp in that picture. Kemp was one of the Republican congressman for an inner-city Buffalo district, was a great advocate of supply-side economic theory. George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush were the four supply-side presidents. So economic management in the supply-side era featured the following elements. Emphasis on supply-side incentivizing rather than incentivizing enterprise rather than trying to manage demand. Focus on the increasing availability of capital. This was the key element of supply side, improving the supply of capital for economy boosting investment. Now, in the supply side era, the budget lost its importance as an instrument of short-term economic management. The supply-side era was, the role of the budget was to strengthen the foundations for the medium and long term rather than the short term. And the need for short-term economic management was now transferred to the chairman of the Federal Reserve. And when Jimmy Carter appointed Paul Volcker chair of the Federal Reserve in the summer of 1979 with a brief to do anything that was possible to control the very high inflation, the double-digit inflation of the late 1970s, in effect that marked the transfer of the status of manager of prosperity from the president now to the chair of the Federal Reserve. Nevertheless, fiscal policy remained very significant as a medium and long-term element in American economic policy. And the final aspect of the supply side era, many historians have pointed this out, is it facilitated the shift from the primary importance of manufacturing in the economy of the mid-20th century to a late 20th century economy where finance, insurance, and real estate really became the principal sources of profitability. And some historians and social scientists, most notably Greta Krippner, have talked about the financialization of the economy in the late 20th century. The financialization of the economy, the supply side era, was also accompanied by massive and seemingly permanent deficits. The deficit, which had been largely controlled during the Keynesian era, became an almost permanent fact of life during the supply side era, the exception being, of course, the Clinton second term. But that graph there shows, you can see the revenue levels and the expenditure levels. The revenue levels are the bars, the expenditure levels are the line going above the revenue bars for the most part, except in the late 1990s. Now, the explosion of the deficit during the 1980s was largely due to the huge tax cuts enacted by the Reagan presidency, the huge Reagan defense expansion, and a severe recession of 1981-1982, where the Federal Reserve adopted a monetarist approach to choke inflation out of the American economy, successfully doing so, but at the cost of the most serious recession since the 1930s. Now, as these deficits reach levels, peacetime levels never seen before, the problem the United States faced was how to finance government borrowing. And the answer was to import capital from abroad. This was a period when the age of globalization was taking off, and it benefited the United States that it could become a haven for the movement of capital inflows from Europe, from Asia, and other places. Now, how that was done, the Federal Reserve reduced interest rates in the wake of the recession of 1981-1982, but they kept real interest rates relatively high. Real interest rates are the actual interest rates minus the rate of inflation. And American interest rates were kept relatively high. This attracted foreign capital into the United States, where returns were much greater, and this was a great age for the American financial sector. The United States now had a plentiful capital, which had been in relatively short supply because of regulations, government regulations, and other factors during the Keynesian era. But now the United States had this ready supply of capital coming in from abroad. This pumped up the dollar as foreigners bought treasury securities and other dollar assets, and this worked to the benefit of the American financial sector, but it hurt the manufacturing sector. As the dollar rose in value, because foreigners were buying dollar assets, what that meant was that foreign goods became much cheaper to buy in the American market, and American goods became much dearer abroad, and the consequence was an import boom and a significant expansion of the trade deficit. Now, in the 1990s, the concern grew that the deficit simply had to be controlled. There was a fear that things could not go on as they were, and it was left to Bill Clinton to deal with the consequences of the Reagan-Bush deficits and the concerns of the bond market and Wall Street in general, that unless something was done to control the deficit in the long term, inflation of 1970s level would return. And Clinton bit the bullet and promoted the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1993, which reversed deficit growth. The Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1993 was very significant as being the first major and successful effort to control the deficit since it had exploded in the early Reagan era. And its success reassured the Federal Reserve and reassured the bond markets, with the consequence that they were able to reduce interest rates for borrowers in the belief, without worry that in the long term their credit would be devalued by a declining dollar. The result was a massive boom on Wall Street, which delivered the revenues of a balanced budget. Ultimately, in Clinton's second term, the economic boom, which centered on Wall Street, delivered balanced budgets, but it was unsustainable. And in 2001, the dot-com bubble, as it was called, burst, ending the prospect. There were many people in the year 2000 speaking of budget surpluses rolling into the future that would eventually eliminate the public debt within 10 years. But what happened instead, the bursting of the dot-com bubble, George Bush's tax cuts combined to return the budget deep into the red once more after the black period of the late 1990s. Now, in conclusion, what can I say? Presidential economic management, I would argue, was most successful in the Keynesian era. But we have to recognize that structural advantages benefited it. There was a need for high military outlays in the early Cold War. B, America's economic competitors, primarily in Europe, were still recovering from the Second World War. And even in that period, even in the decade and a half after World War II, poverty rates remained high. In 1960, figures vary, but somewhere between 20 and 25% of Americans lived under an official poverty line. So prosperity was fairly broad-based, but by no means universal. Supply-side economic management was most successful in benefiting financial capital, but it was damaging in many respects for the manufacturing sector of the United States. And in contrast to the manufacturing era dominance, when well-paid blue-collar jobs were plentiful, in the supply-side era, the era of financialization, the benefits flowed to an elite in the main, with the consequence that the supply-side era is linked to to the growth in income inequality. But despite their differences, I suggest there is one common theme in Keynesian era management and supply-side presidential economics, and it is this. In both eras, presidential efforts to maximize economic growth have resulted in economic instability. Presidents, in trying to push the economy forward, have tended to aggravate the inherent instability of capitalism. So there is always a price to pay for short-term success. And that has been true in the 1960s and in the 1980s and in the early years of this century. What to say about future? Historians should never predict the future, which means I'm going to do so. I suggest we're entering a new era. I can't definitely prove this because we're still in the early stages, but I suggest that the need to control the public debt will become increasingly important in the next 10 to 20 years. The debt is growing much faster than the economy. That will be very important to reverse, and that reversal can only be achieved through sacrifice. Presidents up to now have offered pain-free promises of prosperity. I suggest over the next 20 years we will return to perhaps a 19th century culture of the need for sacrifice for the public economic good. Thank you very much.
I had some slides, but it didn't look like they're working. That's fine. So I'd like to join my fellow panelists in thanking the Larkin family, thanking Mark and Roger, and Steve, and especially Zella. This is a lot of fun. It's great to be here. Oh, there we go. So as you can see, I'm here to talk about what we might call the anti-government impulse, which is certainly something that characterizes modern politics. But what I want to suggest is that we are living in a modern era that's in some ways different. Of course, we've always had the anti-government impulse in American politics. In lots of ways, we were a country founded on suspicion of centralized authority. But what I want to talk about a bit today is why I think this modern era is different, and why I think what we may be living in, for lack of a better way to frame it, is, or a better, more felicitous way to frame it, is an era of anti-government governance, right? Traditionally, we might have sent politicians to Washington to solve problems with government. And largely over the last 40 years, I'm going to suggest, since Nixon, we often send politicians, presidents to Washington to solve problems of governance. And Nixon, in many ways, was the first president, a modern president, that had that mandate. Think of the silent majority, their concerns about busing, law and order. These were problems they perceived as being caused by government. And Nixon really believed that he could sort of synthesize this and build new trust in government. In 1971, he said, "The great danger is that this momentary disillusionment with government will turn into a more profound and lasting loss of faith." And as this polling data suggests, Nixon was not able to do the trick. The momentary disillusionment that he sensed in the late 1960s has, in fact, become a very profound and lasting loss of faith, from a post-war peak of 78% of public trust in government. Actually, it's even worse than this. I heard on NPR last week that we're at 19% now. And so it characterizes an era, right? But what I want to suggest today is that this sort of steady downward slope in trust in government can't simply be explained by public sector failures. And what I want to suggest is that the emergence of the market as an alternative delivery method for social goods over the same period has really contributed sort of politically and culturally to this declining faith in government. And I want to suggest that this idea of the market is something different than earlier calls for private enterprise or the business system, or in the 19th century you'd hear about the business cycle. That as a conceptual development, the market as an autonomous system is somehow new, as something that sort of exists like gravity out there, and that this has accelerated these trends towards a declining faith in government. Where do presidents fit in? I think presidents, as we've seen, have an important role to play at the bully pulpit. I think a really a nice way to sum this up, the historian Daniel Rogers has written that presidents set into circulation mental pictures of society and its field of obligations, right? Like what do we owe each other? Presidents help us understand what our commitments are, what are our rights and responsibilities. And Rogers has said that the most commanding visions offer a theory of society and politics. And these commanding visions, these theories of society and politics, have the power to reshape those fields of obligations, what we owe each other. And I want to suggest that the market, as a metaphor for society, as a vision of society and its obligations, has been a really commanding metaphor over the last 40 years that presidents have played a role in. I want to thank Ewan because you've done a lot of the work for me here and sort of the spade work that I said, this is tough. I don't know if I can get through this. But what I want to just sort of bracket here, and this is sort of Kennedy explaining a lot of the things that Ewan just explained to you all, which is this sort of age of confidence that we emerged out of World War II in. What I think Ewan very accurately called presidents frame themselves as managers of prosperity, right? And as part of this, they took political credit for that growth. The 1960 election is a really interesting one because growth itself became politicized. And so presidents, especially Kennedy, begin to take credit for the economic growth that seems to be structuring this exploding quality of life for Americans in these post-war years. To the extent that so many policies that the United States government had offered, Social Security, federal insurance for mortgages, were driving all of this exploding economic growth. And so Kennedy says, why don't I take credit for this? Nixon, of course, faces the beginnings of a shifting political landscape, right? In 1967, public opinion pollsters Hadley Cantrill and Lloyd Free published a book called The Political Beliefs of Americans, and they had a very sort of perceptive thesis. It's very simple, which was that Americans were still ideological conservatives, right? They still were suspicious of government. But through all of this growth, through all of these subtle social securities that the state had begun to offer, they had become operational liberals. So they wanted a limited government, but they really wanted that government to take care of everything for them. And so this becomes a real political problem as we enter the 1970s and these economic forces that Ewan outlined, because traditionally an economic crisis in the 19th century might not have been a political crisis. But because of these expectations that presidents had courted and the political credit they'd taken for the growth, an economic crisis in the 1970s becomes a real political crisis and becomes a crisis of state legitimacy, right? Our political leaders no longer have control over the situation which they promised they would. As Brian noted yesterday, Gerald Ford offers this whip inflation now. You know, if you don't like prices at the grocery store, maybe grow a garden, right? This is not a commanding theory of society. This isn't going to sort of reshape the nation's politics. And as Brian mentioned yesterday, Jimmy Carter, it pillars Americans for their reliance on things, right? And as part of that, he wasn't simply interested in sort of Americans' materialism. He also wanted Americans to stop looking to the state to solve all these problems, right? So by 1978, one of my favorite quotes, Carter says, "Government cannot solve our problems. It cannot set our goals. It cannot define our vision. Government cannot eliminate poverty or provide a bountiful economy or reduce inflation or save our cities or cure literacy or provide energy," right? So don't look at me, right? So this is a very different political era than just 15 years before, when Kennedy is very confidently walking the United States through all the ways that his administration is structuring growth. And so in this period of the 1970s, Americans are looking for explanations. They're looking for people who can sort of unpack for them what are these economic forces. And I don't want to suggest here that Milton Friedman caused all of this. But I do want to suggest, actually, that Walter Heller, in calling the 1960s the age of the economist, in some ways, I actually think he was a little ahead of his time. Because in the 1970s, Americans begin looking for economic understanding of these forces that are buffeting them, right? And so Milton Friedman, actually, a monetarist economist, really sort of marginal for most of the post-war period, a Hayekian, University of Chicago school. He is a frequent appearance makes frequent appearances on Donahue, right? So Americans are sitting at home and folding their laundry, watching daytime television, and Milton Friedman is explaining to them monetary policy. They may not understand it, but I think it begins to get at this idea that Americans are searching for answers. They're searching for explanations. And so these ideas, these economic theories, these economic metaphors gain circulation during this time. And to sort of indicate this, Google, I've said to the scholars, this is hardly scientific, but Google has begun digitizing millions of books. And what they enable you to do is to take a search term, and you can search within the text of all of these books, and you can get a sense of the relative frequency with which these terms show up over time. And so it's during the 1970s that the notion of the economy takes off, right? Americans are reading books that describe what the economy is. And this is different than an economy, or previously when economy meant thrift, right? This is the economy with a definite article, an object to be studied, right? And as part of this, during the 1970s, this is when the notion of a free market takes off, right? We often think of this as something that has sort of always been with us, but as a conceptual notion, something that's out there to be understood, the free market takes its roots in the 1970s. And so these metaphors and ideas and words and ways of understanding the economic system are in circulation, but they can't just come together as a theory or a vision of society, right? You're going to have an author for this. And so Ronald Reagan, his first political breakthrough, of course, nationally, comes in the early 1960s when he's campaigning for Barry Goldwater. And probably one of the most lasting developments of that campaign was his A Time for Choosing speech, in which he compares the looming American welfare state with Soviet communism. His really wonderful turn of phrase is he says, the 64 election is a choice between preserving for our children the last best hope of man on earth, or sentencing them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness, right? But for the most part, Reagan's posture in this speech and for much of his political development was defensive. This was a vision that political theorists say was grounded in negative liberty, right? Freedom from government oppression. And Reagan understood that this was an inherently politically weak position at the time. And actually, there's an interesting passage in A Time for Choosing where he sort of explains this to his listeners. He says, anytime you and I question the schemes of the do-gooders, right, the liberal welfare state builders, anytime we question their schemes, we're denounced as being opposed to their humanitarian goals. It seems impossible to legitimately debate their solutions with the assumption that all of us share the desire to help the less fortunate. They tell us we're always against, never for anything, right? And I think as a diagnosis for especially Goldwater's failure in '64 and Reagan's difficulty courting a national electorate even up through 1976, this is actually a pretty astute diagnosis. The United States in the early 1960s is confronting rural poverty, urban poverty. They're talking about putting a man on the moon. Reagan's invocation of liberty and freedom is sort of a solution in search of a problem at the time. And as a theory of society at the time, it doesn't have much to offer. But of course, over the 1970s, as government spending becomes politicized, there's a new cultural common sense that links it to inflation. All of a sudden, Reagan has some cachet. Of course, he beats Carter in 1980. As some historians are beginning to argue, however, like Judith Stein, for instance, by 1980, Reagan still didn't have much of a mandate. He still didn't have much of a positive program or a vision for policymaking. What he had was a plan to get government off the silent majority's back, right? And so he makes the largest tax cut in American history, 23%, and he's got to cut $35 billion of spending to even begin to think about balancing the budget. And 60% of that cut comes in poverty programs. So he is cutting American taxes on the back of poverty programs. And this is a vision of society that's fairly punitive, actually, and rather quickly, Reagan faces a very fierce backlash, even from Republicans. One Republican senator calls the whole program baloney. And so he is faced with the need to come up with a vision of society that includes the worst off. He's got to come up with a way of solving a problem of poverty. And what Reagan reaches for are these swirling market metaphors in the 1970s in a way that he'd never used them before. And he reaches across the pond to Margaret Thatcher and pulls this program over called enterprise zones, which is simply just cutting taxes and regulations in pockets of poverty in cities or in some rural areas. And it's a pretty, not a very path-breaking program here, right? But Reagan frames it. He finds his vision of society in selling this program. He says these zones will demonstrate that freedom of enterprise can succeed where government has failed if given the chance. And here it is. The incentives and natural market forces thus unleashed will be of primary benefit to America's disadvantaged citizens in our most oppressed areas. So this absence of government program will serve as a social program. The market forces will do this, right? But to Americans 15 years earlier, in the early 1960s, who are encountering rural poverty, the metaphors they used to describe that rural poverty was that these Americans were in a state of nature, right? So the argument that there are natural market forces out there simply wouldn't have computed prior to this era of the 1970s and these new market metaphors in circulation. And so I just want to sort of conclude by making a few points about this, because one of the things that I love about this cartoon is that from our modern vantage point, I'm not quite sure who it's making fun of, right? Because you've got the big government, which is handing down welfare, but then you've got rungs of freedom being lowered down to the poor, right? Which, as we know in our period of increasing inequality, that hasn't quite lifted the poor up out of poverty. But what I want to return to this anti-government impulse idea here, and why I think the market as a metaphor for the anti-government impulse is a really sort of revolutionary moment. And if we take poverty as our policy area, if you were against the government program prior to the market idea, it was probably because you had an idea of an institution that should be better served taking care of that problem, right? Maybe it's local government, maybe it's a charity, maybe it's a philanthropy. But the market idea decouples social responsibility and sort of embodied institutions from taking care of a given area of social provision. And it becomes incredibly politically intoxicating for politicians, because they can invoke a market force and not have to name an actor to borrow another presidential term, where the buck will stop, right? You no longer have to take responsibility for it because the market will do it. And so I think as a modern form of this anti-government impulse, we're in sort of brave new territory here in terms of, to come back to some of the themes we've talked about, this field of obligations, what we owe each other. Brian touched on it yesterday, Ewan touched on it, this notion of sacrifice and what we owe each other as a society. So I'll stop there and look forward to hearing questions and the rest of the papers. Thank you.
Good morning, y'all. Thank you for coming out here early on a Thursday morning. I guess it's not early at this point in the morning. And I need to thank, of course, everyone at Florida Atlantic University, of course, the Larkin family, and of course, Zella, Steve, and Mark. I need to warn you a little bit that there was a slight title change when I actually finished the paper for this conference, which was actually Educator and Creditor-in-Chief, the American Presidency, Higher Education, and the Student Loan Industry. Initially, I thought that was a way of narrowing the topic. And then it's up to you if you think tackling the student loan industry, a $6 trillion industry, is smaller or bigger. So let's start out actually in November of '65, when President LBJ triumphantly returned to his alma mater, the former Southwest Texas State College, in order to sign, quote, legislation passed by this Congress that will swing open a new door for the young people of America. And he predicted for them and for the entire land of ours, it is the most important door that will ever open, the door to education. In many ways, he was right about the Higher Education Act of '65. The growth of American colleges and universities in the post-war era is often considered one of the country's most remarkable achievements. Presidents preceding and succeeding LBJ have often said as much as they signed into law other bills designed to aid schools, professors, and of course, students. And these laws and programs did much to expand the number, size, and quality of universities, not to mention colleges. And in the process, mass higher education, through a mix of private and public institutions, how American is that, became a key social guarantee, which dramatically expanded upward mobility, improved national defense, and of course, aided business innovation. Yet the current crisis in higher ed highlights that educational access increased alongside the birth and rapid development of the student loan industry. And education experts have long recognized that American student debt is a defining feature and product of the American market-driven higher education model. All schools, whether public or private, depend on a range of revenue streams, but they're basically the same, because American federal and state policymakers have rarely and inconsistently provided direct funding. Business investment and philanthropic support has also waxed and waned substantially over time, even for the nation's most elite stratum of schools. Subsequently, tuition and fees have always been one of the most guaranteed general income streams, so not the kind of earmarked streams that can only be used for certain things, such as research labs. Enrollment needs have dictated the ways that schools compete for students, but also their but also their dependence on federal and state policymakers guaranteeing undergraduates and graduates be able to take out college loans. That post-war assurance also became important to private lenders, whose participation in the federal loan program secured a return on their investment. Now, this government commitment, along with the recently privatized loan market for securitized student debt, also unintentionally underwrote the far riskier loans these financiers increasingly offered privately. Now, American presidents have played an important role in expanding education by nurturing this student loan industry, whose $1 trillion in debt obligations now account for about 6% of GDP. FDR, for example, largely kept with the American tradition of leaving higher ed up to the states or the institutions themselves, a decision that dictated as much by his initial disinterest in bailing out educators as by leading academics' fear that federal aid would come at the expense of academic freedom. Now, what FDR did was inaugurated a federal tradition of using student assistance to indirectly underwrite higher ed's expansion. Presidents and educational appointees used that approach when negotiating with Congress over the shape of the 44 GI Bill, the 58 National Defense Education Act, the Sputnik legislation, and the 65 Higher Education Act, which contained a provision for federally guaranteed student loans. Now, since passage, presidents have played a far more indirect role, actually, as educator and creditor-in-chief, because fluctuating loan rates, new payback plans, and increased campus fees need to be attributed to the Department of Education's staffers, school administrators, financial aid officers, state legislatures, and higher-ups in this sprawling financial aid industry, which includes not just the private lenders, but intermediaries between federal appointees and the students and schools that they were supposed to serve. Now, they all spend time lobbying for both the periodic direct congressional reauthorizations of the Higher Education Act. By the way, the most current one is about a couple of years overdue. And they also lobby for indirect modifications by an estimated 7,000 sections of federal regulations just pertaining to loans. Now, many of those changes do not require presidential signatures, usually the occasion for presidents to celebrate what higher education means to the citizenry. Now, I'd like to offer a sense of how president's role evolved alongside federal financial aid and the importance of the presidency to it. Now, the interesting thing about financial aid, it's only recently that it actually meant loans to go to school. Financial aid, for most of the 20th century actually, usually meant institutional aid, whether it was coming from wealthy benefactors or for philanthropies, and that includes, actually, interesting enough, for state schools. The great myth of the land grant tradition, the land grant, the sale of the land actually only gives you the startup capital to start a college or university. It's up to the legislatures to keep funding them, and many of them throughout the South and the West actually do not, much less the fact that the land grant money in the Northeast and parts of the Midwest actually went to private schools, like MIT. Now, the interesting thing is wealthy donors would offer aid for students, usually first in the importance of merit and then need. And that reflects the fact that for much of the history of American higher education into the mid-20th century, tuition was relatively low. The real expense of going to school was that you had to be able to have the time, or rather your family had to have the time to spare you so you could actually go to school. And especially since much of the American education tradition was actually taking place remotely, not in cities. The earliest loans that we see are actually in the 1920s. They're completely private, and it actually is timed with a surge of enrollments in higher education following World War I, but also the search for new financial products. And that's one of the reasons loans were not on the table during the New Deal. When I went through the National Youth Administration's records, as well as some of the other leading New Dealers, you actually did see constituents, a handful writing in, asking about loans. They're either completely ignored in the correspondence about this feedback, or they're just laughed at, to be honest. Because what, if you think about it, are you actually putting a loan on? How do you repossess someone's education? You actually can't. Now, the interesting thing is, there would be no comprehensive New Deal for higher education, partly because educators flat out didn't want it. The leading ones in the National Education Association and some of the most flagrantly anti-new educators are actually surprised to us today because we don't associate them as such. One of the most famous ones being James Conant, who had no interest in it whatsoever and thought the New Deal dangerous and experimentation. Then, the other interesting thing is that the New Dealers themselves were actually slow to see it important. And this is actually very much the case with FDR, who flat out said in the early months of the New Deal there would be no New Deal for higher education because of his experience as governor, where he saw most people who had a higher education degree in New York State had from a teacher's college. Teachers had the highest unemployment. From his point of view, why would I bail out an academy that is actually not giving anyone the tools that they need to actually to make a living? Now, the interesting thing, it's actually the work programs that actually prove that there is both a need from the citizenry for advanced learning, but also a demand. And this is principally first through the CCC camps and the schoolhouses, and that excitement, that yearning, the writing into the administration about what it meant to be able to take reading classes and literacy classes and other actually advanced classes in the humanities and social, well, not the social sciences, but public programmings in the 30s that impressed upon the New Dealers the importance and potential of actually building a liberal citizenry when they're sending out these projects out there, and that the citizenry actually wanted it. Now, the interesting thing is the political climate at the time, when they're really sort of coming that there might be some direct aid really sort of needed, means that it's actually not going to be possible. And it's strange because the National Youth Administration is actually created in 1935, and we think it might have been possible. It was not, which is why the NYA was actually created by an executive order. And FDR gave a lot of leeway to his two picks to head it. Brains Truster Hans Taussig, as well as Southern liberal radical Aubrey Williams. And the interesting thing is they are also constrained about this fear and this concern about direct federal involvement in state and private schools. And so what they're doing is they're offering work study to willing schools and students. Students had to apply for it, and then the NYA directors, LBJ was one of them, actually put them in touch with schools willing to accept this aid and willing to put students to work while they earn the money that they can then pay their tuition. So it's a very interesting indirect means of doing it, which would, in a way, be repeated in the 1944 GI Bill, the argument being that these veterans had already worked off their debt and therefore had earned these educational obligations. And the interesting thing about there, in the terms of the power of the presidency, the hope from FDR when he let Aubrey Williams do a lot of the work in terms of shaping the executive branch's plans was that it would be housed under the GI Bill, and all the provisions, including education, would be housed under the executive bureaucracy. The American Legion, with the help of William Randolph Hearst, fought and put it in the Veterans Administration, which walled off those benefits. They recognized that what the New Dealers were trying to do during World War II, these erstwhile New Dealers, was put it under the executive branch so it could be eventually extended to the entire citizenry, which of course didn't happen. And the interesting thing about the education aspect of the GI Bill, which is now in many ways the most famous aspect of it, was that it was either incredibly controversial. Educators like Conant, as well as U Chicago's Hutchins, completely fought it. Hutchins' famous line being, "You will turn our colleges and universities into hobo jungles if you make us take working class warriors." He didn't say the working class warrior sides, but he did say hobo jungles. And it was bitterly fought by educators. Congress completely ignored it. They didn't think that anyone would be interested in going to college after serving in World War II, and my goodness, were they proved wrong, where the GIs actually went in a tidal wave that schools could actually not keep up with it. And the sad thing about it was the way that they structured the loans was this indirect way, was that the maximum tuition payment to schools directly from the federal government was more than it cost to go to Harvard at the time, which was an indirect way of making schools raise their tuition so they could shove the money in that way, and really started this tradition of the importance of tuition raises to make up for budget shortfalls of expansion. That would actually not be the case, interestingly enough, with the first federal loans, which are actually a part of the NDA. The NDA actually has a very small, short-term loan program. It's a couple of years, it's a low interest rate, but it's not, what we usually think of in terms of the student loan programs of today. And the whole program was designed to pay for itself. It was designed to pay for itself, came directly from the federal government. it itself was not controversial. The very idea that you had federal involvement in higher education, even in this way, in the broad range of what the Sputnik legislation actually covered, that was the huge controversy. And when you look at the role of the presidency, as well as his staffers, they in many ways had taken a step back. They're working at the most incredible moments in the Cold War abroad, or a lot of those hot wars in the Third World. They're not taking a big look on this, but one of the things that they are adamant against is that the liberal Democrats will not use NDA as the national defense as an excuse to get the broad investment in the federal government in higher education, nor will they cede the issue to the conservative Republicans like Barry Goldwater, who think you can pay for everyone's higher education by just giving them a tax break. And so you see actually staffers, Eisenhower staffers, trying to figure out how to maneuver between these two wings in Congress. Now, the program familiar to us all today, the loan program, the indirect loan program, the federal government brokering loans from private lenders and to students and schools, that's a part of the Great Society and LBJ. And the interesting thing is, LBJ in that speech was so open that he was really the lender-in-chief. Much of the policies that he actually talks about in that speech that I opened with is all about the loan program. Less so the other titles in the Higher Education Act, because the loan program is actually fourth. It's seemingly buried. And the interesting thing about that is behind closed doors, the loan program was of the utmost importance to his staff, not just in their negotiations with Congress, who would think about it as part of a package of financial aid for students, but also the very tense negotiations with the American Banking Association, called in to figure out what these financial products would actually look like. Because again, you're not actually guaranteeing anything you can repossess. And the interesting thing is the bankers are interested in it because they're looking at this moment in the 60s for a new financial product. They have no interest in keeping banking boring. We're already seeing the financialization that we normally associate with a later period in time. Now, the interesting thing about this, LBJ does not talk about those tense negotiations, that thinking about the loan program and how to get business support for it or congressional support for it. Publicly, he actually talks a lot about tax breaks and lead up to the sign-up legislation, which I think is actually trying to steal the Goldwater agenda at a moment when he's trying, if we read Kim Phillips-Fine's book, trying to make sure that Goldwater doesn't really have that business constituency, which are his natural allies. And the thing is, he, as well as the Office of Education underneath him in Congress, will celebrate that the loan program itself, as well as the other financial assistance programs for students, really kept federal involvement indirect and really did a lot to preserve institutional power, because it's basically a block grant, excuse me, not a block grant, a block sum given to schools to decide how they want to give the grants and loans and other student financial aid. And that's one of the ways that 65 really does seem like a watershed moment, not only really for the start of the student loan industry, because it is those guaranteed federal loans that entice bankers into this new financial product where they have this security on return of investment from somewhere that they might start, as tuition starts to rise, start sort of offering private loans as well. They have this sort of, they can take a risk on those private loans. But the other reason 65 seems like a watershed is that the president's role as the educator or lender in chief really seems to lessen, because the presidents from then on lose a lot of their authority on what goes on. The best example of that is one of the most important reauthorizations of this act in 1972. It's a story we normally tell about Claiborne Pell versus Edith Green fighting over the basic grants, which are now named after Pell, which come directly for the federal government based on need, bypassing the universities. Now, the fun story is that Green actually wins in the end, though she dramatically leaves the education subcommittee because she goes to the Budget Bureau and just cuts the funding for it. It never was actually fully funded. But the real story of the 72 reauthorization is the suggestion from Nixon aides about enticing bankers even more, because there's not as much as they had hoped for in terms of getting that private money available to loan out to students, by creating Sallie Mae, modeled off of Fannie Mae. And that is a huge sea change in terms of just greasing the wheels for the start of a small student loan industry with a mix of federally guaranteed and then just private loans into the colossus that we have today. Now, another important sort of symbolic sort of reauthorization that you can see about just how little less presidential input would be is in 1986, when Congress would celebrate the huge extension of the loan program to non-traditional students, farm workers, folks with disabilities, single parents, all sorts of things, and a very small direct loan program coming directly from the federal government because of concerns about already the student loan industry coming. Reagan hated it. He hated it, but he signed it into law. And that's a big shift. That's an important thing because you're going to see a lot less presidential authority and control. A great example being under Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton had actually wanted to, and this is where he's a difficult person to sort of pin down. In his early years, he had wanted to get rid of the guaranteed loan program altogether because of how much the financial aid industry was profit driven. Well, he can't do it. There's no way he can get it in the reauthorization. But what he does get is he gets what is now one of the most important parts of being able to afford higher education or paying it back. He gets the tax credits, not through the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, but he gets it through the tax legislation that he famously signed into law. The guaranteed indirect program actually ended in 2010. I'm not sure many people know that, because when Obama signed the Health Care and Education Reconciliation Act, he included a rider that cut out the middlemen between the Education Department, universities, and students. So now it is actually new loans are just direct loans from the federal government. Nevertheless, past borrowers, of course, must still repay the federal loans offered through banks and most often securitized and then sold by Sallie Mae, which was, of course, also privatized under Clinton. Now, few Americans took note at all of this end run, this presidential end run around a long overdue and stalled reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. Most Americans consider the tuition tax write-offs far more sacrosanct. It is, in fact, a third rail in American tax write-offs right now, right there, I think, on par with mortgages. And it doesn't really ease alumni's financial burdens. 2 seconds. Experts have shown that only the wealthiest Americans earned enough to get the full benefit of a so-called reform that actually privileged attendance in the country's most expensive schools. And Obama still echoed LBJ's remarks when he traveled to a Northern Virginia community college and said, that's 2 major victories in 1 week. The first, of course, was health care. The second, the end of the once revered graduate loan program, a sweetheart deal in federal law that essentially just gave billions to banks. Thank you.
We'll give our speakers one more round of applause. Very, very good panels. I just thought I'd mention quickly at the Professor Shermer's talk made me think of this. One of the points of pride for FAU, in fact, is in 1964 at the groundbreaking. LBJ came and spoke here in the middle of all of that great spending. In fact, Florida itself has most of our universities were created in the late 50s and early 60s in that same era. So it's sort of interesting. Now it's time for questions. So if you want to ask questions, we have microphones at either side. If you would, try to make your way to them so everyone can hear you. I think we've had a really good panel, sort of bookending on either end 2 very specific looks, one at the military-industrial complex, the other at the educational-industrial government complex. Within the middle, 2 good discussions of the nuts and bolts of economics and also I think the ideological underpinnings of how Americans have understood economics. To sort of start us off, I think I'll ask one question of the group that here in our electoral season, in which it appears that a centrifuge has hit one of the political parties, if not both of them. It's a question about bipartisanship. In all of the papers, I think, there is a focus on how larger economic ideals have sort of ridden over those ideological commitments that would traditionally be seen through parties. both with Eisenhower and ideas of modern republicanism, but also Bill Clinton and his open embrace of free market ideologies. They sort of turn each party on its head and turn them inward against each other. What do you all think that sort of bipartisan economic thinking has done for political parties, and what do you think the future of those political parties will be, these sort of 19th century institutions for rounding up votes? How do they work now in this new era?
How do we turn this on? Oh, okay. I don't think they do work. I mean, I think that that's what you're seeing, right now, is that you're literally not, in order to get out of the primaries with a vote, you're actually basically unelected in a general election. And I think it's a function of it, and especially some of the most, when you look at not only 08 and 12, and the very different ancillary groundwork that had to be done by different kinds of organizations to get the vote out is a testimony that it's not really working. And I think also when you look at party affiliation is incredibly low. That says something. It says something. And I think that it doesn't. It speaks to the farce. I mean, I've been talking to my students about this right now. The farce that a lot of Americans think American politics is, and it seems so divorced from their reality, both who ends up being elected into law and what a president can actually do. And I think that that's the key thing. And I think it's a very interesting moment of figuring out how the parties are going to have to start to function and adapt. And you're already seeing it. And I think it's quite interesting. And also how different organizations like labor unions have also adapted in this brave new world where their membership can't also be guaranteed to get out and vote.
Well, looking at this as an outsider and trying to project forward, it seems to me, I brought up the public debt in the last moment of my talk. As that becomes more significant, as the debt GDP ratio increases, it has to be dealt with. And economic growth, I very much doubt that economic growth will dent it. So we come back to sacrifice, and it seems to me, as an outsider, that each party has to slaughter one of its sacred cows. The Democrats have to accept some degree of entitlement reform, and the Republicans have to agree some kind of revenue enhancement, which is a fancy way of saying tax increase. When this will happen is anybody's guess. I don't think it will happen as a result of leadership, because leadership is dependent on persuasion, and persuasion is very difficult in an age of polarization. Therefore, my rather gloomy prognostication is that when things get bad enough, there will be action.
Yeah, just on that point as well, I think one of the points I didn't come back to at the end, but I think is still the case, is that this paradox about American politics, where we're ideological conservatives and operational liberals, I think has remained largely true. And I think one of the really interesting facts about the Tea Party movement was that they, I think in a large degree, were a product of politicians leaning heavily on the ideological conservatism part and not speaking clearly about the need to maintain some of the financial support for some of the things that make us operational liberals, right? And so you've got a Tea Party movement that says cut, 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 and then you've got politicians who get in and say, there's not a whole lot more to cut. We can be a little bit more efficient. And so I think what we may be in is the beginnings of a moment of sort of a great reckoning and reshuffling, where you've actually got a politician like Bernie Sanders who's speaking very clearly about the need for certain forms of government, right? And like him or not, you've got Trump who, he hasn't done it yet, but I'm waiting for him to frame his wall as a public works project. But we'll see if he does that.
Because I think the most amazing thing about when they were doing a lot of just the on-the-ground interviews in Ohio, that a lot of people, their first and second choice was Sanders and then Trump. And I think that actually sort of speaks to it. And I think what's interesting is that where I wouldn't call it bipartisanship, but where you see people working is actually behind closed doors. They've had however many votes to repeal Obamacare since the most recent coverage thing, but what is actually happening behind closed doors is chipping away and making it palatable, right? And you don't put that on Fox News or MSNBC, which are two sides of the same coin, and you're missing the story of how these things are changing. And it's the same thing about how Social Security benefits were chipped away and stuff like that. It's a story lost to the side, and then people are left with an ideological sort of milieu of, freedom is the most vacuous word in American politics these days. Who can make sense of that when it doesn't align at all with their lived experience? And how do you I think you're absolutely right. It's a reckoning.
The notion that Reagan added $1.9 trillion to the debt, raised the debt ceiling 18 times, expand Social Security, these sorts of things that are very much in line with sort of the operational liberalism, but he didn't feel that he had the political space to actually speak positively about those things. He could never have claimed, which he knew from his time as governor, that defense spending is big business, right? There's some interesting work coming out about his interest in courting the defense state as governor as an economic development policy for the state. And so I think what we may be approaching is a period when politicians will be enabled to actually speak a little bit more clearly about what it is that they actually see government doing. And that would be a positive on both sides.
Any question? My ringer.
Hi, thank you all for your papers. They're all very interesting. I have two questions, since there's not a line. My first is for Dr. Wilson. You mentioned the Eisenhower farewell address, military-industrial complex speech a couple times, and I was wondering if you could provide us with a bit of your explanation for where that speech came from, because I find that my students are often incredulous that somebody with Eisenhower's military background would have given a speech like that. And then my second question is just for the panel in general. One of the patterns I noticed was that you all framed your discussion of the president and the economy largely in domestic terms. So I'm curious if you could talk a bit about the flip side of that and how much global economic forces might impact the president's ability to deal with spending or the market, or even student loans, especially now that there's more focus on getting international students here into the United States. So, thanks.
Oh, these are working? Yeah, so there's actually some pretty good work on the Eisenhower speech. James Ledbetter, who's a journalist, has a pretty good book that Yale brought out a couple years ago. So there's a lot going on there, and part of the context is, of course, President Eisenhower's struggles against the military establishment in the 50s in terms of budgets, right, and kind of control. There is some of the work I've read suggests that he was annoyed by defense contractor lobbying and advertising, and so there are accounts of him looking at ads that Boeing placed on all the money that Boeing and other Lockheed are spending on this advertising. It really bothers him. And he's seeing what I tried to describe today, which is, he studied industrial mobilization back when he was a young officer in the interwar period. He's seen the defense sector not just become bigger, but more privatized, and with the contractors more power. And I think that was part of the impetus of the speech. So.
Well, that's a very important point, I think. One of the distinctions between the Keynesian era I was talking about and the supply side era is that economic management becomes much more difficult in the supply side era because we are in the age of globalization. America's capacity to control or indeed manage economic forces is diminished as a result. And there is one big advantage the United States has and will continue to have for the foreseeable future, I think, is that it is a safe haven for capital. In a world where there is a glut of capital flows, capital is safest in America. Your tax system will always deliver interest on treasury securities that are purchased. There is reasonably transparent financial market operations whereby corruption is not as common as it is in many other parts of the world. So, there is that advantage, but the disadvantage, of course, is the flip side to that, because if capital comes into the United States, what goes out of the United States, and one of the questioners referred to this yesterday, is that you will find it very difficult to compete in terms of labor costs with low-cost economies. So the difficulty of, say, the last 30 years is that it is always cheaper to make things abroad than it is in the United States. And Bill Clinton's big idea was that, okay, we'll go for high-end things, not the mass-produced things. And this was the focus of his putting people first policy, which is the kind of supply-side skill strategy of equipping American workers with training programs, etc., that would enable them to deliver, the high-end products. But of course, in the period between his election and his inauguration, Alan Greenspan and a number of his own officials persuaded him that before he put people first, he had to put the deficit first.
Yeah, I would just say, just in keeping sort of with the theme of my talk about the role of presidents in the bully pulpit and helping Americans understand their place in the economy, that as sort of the global forces, I mean, you see this progression from Carter, who's literally confronting the limitations of presidential power and the Council of Economic Advisors' power to really manage the ship of state in these forces. But as the 80s become the 90s, that market metaphor becomes very powerful, especially as the Berlin Wall comes down and you've got the fall of the Soviet Union, and the market becomes a very optimistic metaphor for a U.S.-led global economy. And so rather than saying that we can control it, it's sort of the world is adopting our principles, and we can be sort of the leader in this global market. And so I think sort of psychically that becomes the mode that presidents take. And within that system, they're very limited what they can actually do.
For the student loan stuff, it's actually really fascinating and somewhat surprising, because I mentioned sort of offhand that one of the reasons why leading members of the American Banking Association were interested to talk to LBJ about this idea of a guaranteed loan program was that there was a sense that they were facing a lot of international competition from banks. International banks have come in, they're not operating under the rules of Glass-Steagall. And that changes things. And the interesting thing, the model, I didn't get a chance to talk about this, the model for the guaranteed loan program and that stuff is actually coming out of Rockefeller, and what Rockefeller does to ensure students can afford the tuition that he mandates must be charged at SUNY, and he tries very hard to get charged at CUNY. And so they're actually taking that, and it was Rockefeller, when his aides, it's not him, when his aides come up with this idea, they're coming from that financial world and they're looking for a way to bail out the banks in upstate New York, which is where a lot of those small SUNYs are built. And it is this way that these small banks are struggling. They need some kind of guarantee. They need a new customer base. They need new financial products. And it is actually that international pressure that it makes it palatable on a national level. The other interesting thing is that, it's a myth. We talk a lot about the rise of American universal banks, which is also growing at the same time that there's an explosion in the student loan industry. It's not surprising, right? These big financial monsters. But a lot of the American universal banks, these are global entities. And you can actually see a lot of foreign capital in this predatory, student loan market. Especially, it's bought and sold, much like there's new research showing that a lot of the stuff being bought and sold on Fannie Mae much earlier than we thought is coming out of foreign banks as well. And I'll say, by the way, in terms of there's a different way that it relates to the transformation of the university itself, not the financial underpinnings of it. But I will say the reason the search for the international students right now, besides the fact that we're coming down the end of the millennial baby boom, and we need to fill seats, right? There's a growthmanship in universities too. International students aren't eligible for student aid and discounting. They're not, and so it's a way of trying to find people who are full freight. What's fascinating is the loan models being talked about abroad. And there's ways that they do and don't follow the American model. And it's a really interesting moment of seeing this. And of course, it makes sense that there's a playing with it. One, the horrors abroad of horror stories of the American student loan industry abroad dampen an actual carbon copy. However, a lot of the financiers being brought in to talk about policy have dealings in the American market. So there's a really interesting interplay there about how this is going to go down abroad.
Thank you.
Again, thank all of you for coming here. One of the areas of pride at Florida Atlantic University is our diversity. We're claimed to be one of the most ethnically and racially diverse schools in the Florida system. And so I'm wondering if, I've been feeling that one of the elements missing in this discussion so far is how this story of the American presidency and capitalism breaks down on race lines and also gender lines, and how we can maybe subdivide this story and shed some light on how that does not necessarily lay equally along these two areas. Thank you.
Yeah, well, certainly, I think one of the points I should reemphasize is I think the only area where we have consistently tried free market policies is in areas of poverty alleviation. You don't see credible presidential candidates proposing free market solutions for growing the middle class, right? What we talk about is mortgage tax deductions, right? And expanding Social Security. It's interesting, Bill Clinton extends Reagan's logic around enterprise zones, actually gets the legislation passed. He calls impoverished areas of urban cities new markets, actually. The first thing he says he's going to do with that surplus in his State of the Union is save Social Security. And so in the area that I'm interested in, what's interesting is that this market metaphor as a way of sort of organizing policy has largely been only experimented on recent immigrants, the poor and minority constituencies, not perhaps entitled to broader benefits of American citizenship.
The question of diversity is actually huge with the student loan thing. The interesting thing is it is actually the concern about race and gender and ethnic, actually, that ethnic opportunity is the reason they do the end run, because the argument is we can't send money to historically black colleges. We can't send money to a women's college. We can't do this. I know will give the money to the students and give them the choice to do it. It makes the market metaphor work. And also the idea was if the most rarefied institutions, Columbia, Harvard, UChicago, are the ones fighting us from the get-go with the NYA, we'll go work with the ones who will accept these students, who will accept this. And that actually ends up sort of changing it. Particularly the Southern liberals, Frank Porter Graham was a huge influence on that. And the sad thing is that getting in right when the GI Bill, right when it's happening, there's actually more women going to school and they lose their places because there's only so many places, because women veterans don't actually get a lot of the GI Bill provisions depending on where they were serving. So it puts men, particularly men who are white or white ethnics in there, because a lot of African Americans limited to going to historically black colleges. It's a very difficult thing. Then the same thing is when you get to the Sputnik legislation, it's a fear then that will be a way of, it's a tool for desegregation, which was one of the hopes of liberal Democrats, without a doubt. Because of the Civil Rights Act in '64, those are gone off the table, right? That's off the table. But the interesting thing is what it becomes is when you get the Pell Grants, when you get opening it up to farm workers in '86, when you get all these things, it becomes a way, it's like, this is the key for the diversity. That's your tool. Like, we'll just put the freedom down. We'll just put the opportunity down, ladders, and you will climb up with it. And the sad thing is that both because of the quality of education, typically offered in terms of, because of persistent racial segregation, a lot of students, first-time college students, they don't actually have, they can't get into high-ranking schools, or if they go, and this is a really sad thing, if they do get in, they often are not acculturated enough in that environment, and there's not enough done with them to actually help them, that they end up not finishing it at places like Emory that did, accept them. It's a horrible story that they covered in the Times. And so it ends up being that they tend to be more saddled with this debt from colleges and universities, which are actually not being able to secure them the job to get back, or that they would even complete it to get back and be able to pay back their loans?
Yes, I suppose if we're talking about the Keynesian era, its aggregate approach to economic management meant that it wasn't always able to deliver the fruits of prosperity where it was most needed, and it required allies like the trade union movement to ensure that blue-collar America got its fair share. But in regards to the principal benefits to let's take African Americans as a group, their greatest moment in the Keynesian era was the Vietnam War. There was a labour shortage, wages were going up, and black poverty rates went down remarkably from about 1966 through to about 1969. Now, with Ronald Reagan, there were two things you could do which would send Reagan into a fury. One was to say that he had been a bad actor in his Hollywood days, and the other one was to say that he was a bigot. And Reagan always said, no, I'm not a bigot, I believe in equality of opportunity, but, he uses that notion of equality of opportunity through freedom from government interference to block affirmative action programs. Reagan's argument is we're all Americans and no group should be privileged. And of course, he refused to recognize that the state was required to mitigate the long-standing discrimination that had held African Americans back. And he could never understand why African Americans would vote 91-9 against him in presidential elections. It was, he says this in one of his memoirs, I could never understand why I couldn't win them over. Well, I think it was fairly straightforward why.
First of all, let me tell you how much I appreciate the quality of the presentations and the analytic thinking that went into them. It's so well done. Thank you. The question that I have, sometimes we always say, well, we'll understand what happened 25 years from now, because you don't really know in real time. But I'm curious as to your perspective on the following. And Dr. Morgan sort of laid out one sense of the future. It may not be the next president, it may be the one after that, who knows, where your role has to be, guys, we got to all hang in there together, make a few changes. That may be what part of the future role of the presidency is. But I'm sort of curious from each of your perspectives, considering that using Dr. Morgan's the Keynesians and then the supply side, and each of those being an arc of policy thinking. Obama's period was very different. Putting the politics aside and assuming that trends don't necessarily follow political parties, just my assumptions. It's sort of curious. So you have in healthcare, you had a massive expansion in healthcare labeled under private sector, but basically government expansion of healthcare. You had a massive expansion in direct involvement in higher education labeled as a kind of a voucher program. Give the money to people, they'll use it best. Very similar. So I'm curious whether you, in any way, thinking of the future, and it may not be the next president, but it's sort of what the future looks like, are we on to yet another swing of history? Is this last 8 years hard-fought political battles, but all battles are hard-fought in politics? Are we on to a new swing where you want to, perhaps not Keynesian versus supply, but we seem to be doing a lot of stuff, government expansion, under the name of private sector, which is fine. So I'm just curious as to your sense of the swing of history. Thank you.
Well, I think to hit on, I think the point that a number of people have raised about this notion of sort of the field of obligations, about sacrifice. We're, relative to 20th century norms, we're at historic low tax rates. So that, as one area that is a shibboleth that we haven't yet been able to sort of tackle, maybe one area that we're going to need to address some of these massive deficits between spending and income. But I think what Obama in some ways tried to do was implement some of the Keynesian policies of juking demand without some of the revenue side. And that
probably won't be long-term sustainable.
Yes, I'm sure we are in a new era, but defining the new era and its characteristics is actually quite difficult. We're coming, I mean, in the 1930s, okay, no one would have predicted that the Keynesian era would have developed in the way that it did. In 1940, the New Deal was at best a limited success, an apparent holding operation. It required World War II, and as Brian Ballack said yesterday, Harry Truman to sell the notion that deficits were a very good thing at times. We're in a moment now where, a moment of extreme polarization. Mind you, the 1930s it ended up in the second half of, in Roosevelt's second term, a period of extreme polarization as well that would have made it difficult to predict post-war consensus. So I don't think that there is a clear thing. I think it will require several sets of presidents. It'll be very interesting, I think, if Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders becomes president of the United States, because that will be the first time since the 1980s that a party has won 3 presidential elections in sequence. And there will be a suggestion that, at least in presidential terms, the Democrats are close to being a majority party, and there would be implications in that. The thing that always strikes me as an observer of the American scene is your tax system, however. You don't tax the rich particularly very much, but surprisingly enough, neither do you tax the people at the bottom. And I'm always reminded of Eisenhower's public address in 1954, where he said that tax payment was a civic obligation. And of course, he was fearful that if it was a Democratic proposal to excuse taxpayers at the lowest end, and he feared that once you begin to excuse people from paying taxes, then you undermine the principle of civic responsibility. And I think, Ronald Reagan, love him or hate him, he cut taxes for the rich, but he also, in the 1986 tax reform, took many, many people off the tax rolls, and I think created this low tax culture that is very different. It is not an advantage to the kinds of issues that I anticipate, but no one knows for certain, the kinds of issues that the United States is going to face over the next 20, 25 years.
Can I do
Oh,
No, it's okay.
Yes, I'm just have a question. How serious is the governmental $19 trillion debt? I was reading in Wikipedia the financial position of the United States that the whole United States has a net asset value of $123 trillion. We have a governmental debt of $19 trillion. That doesn't seem too bad to me. Plus the fact that 40% of our debt is owed to governmental entities. It's not likely the Treasury Department would foreclose on the United States. I'm just wondering if we're looking at, if we can handle a lot more debt than we're handling to do a lot more things to develop the economy, to help people out with a lot of social programs. Are we looking at the debt? Should we be looking at macro debt in a completely different way?
Well, I think your question gets to the heart of, so I was going to say the last question was that the United States is too big to fail, right? And in the similar way that a university is too big to fail, or a universal bank is too big to fail, however, an individual American is seen as. But I think the heart of your question, and especially the proposals coming down the line, says that there's a new concern that individual Americans are allowed to fail. And I think your question gets to the heart of it, is that about this idea about we're surrounded by a rhetoric and not thinking about, well, actually, how much debt is there? How much debt is, what can we actually afford to do? And I think the interesting thing right now, it does seem like an interesting moment where people are actually asking the kinds of questions that you're doing. actually, can we as a nation afford to let individual Americans fail or families fail? And what is the best way to do that? And I think that's actually where the idea of where it might go forward. However, I'm not entirely sure which solutions from this range of the political spectrum are going to come forward about what is the best way to make sure that individuals don't fail. But I think there is a new concern that the Americans actually are on the brink of failing and falling into debt and poverty in ways we haven't seen in 80 years. So what does that mean, and what should we do? I think that is the sort of brave new era, but I can't predict what way they're going to go, especially right now, where historically Americans have done public-private safety nets. There's always been that mix, but now in the political language and lingua franca, it seems corrupt to have private and public influence. Hence the killing of the guaranteed loan program, some of these other things. Well, how do we go forward? Are we actually going to go forward with purely public programs, and what would it take to get that through Congress?
Well, your question reminds me of Abraham Lincoln's famous remark when the debt exploded during the Civil War. Men cannot be much oppressed by a debt which they owe to themselves. The only problem now, you don't owe it to yourself. You owe it 50% of your debt, approximately, you owe to foreign countries. And the problem for the United States, you're absolutely right, I think, that you could afford to do more, but it's this perception of foreign treasury security holders, because you are very dependent on them to keep on funding the debt. In foreign eyes, I suspect, the concern is that as the debt-GDP ratio grows, the United States will fall into the temptation of monetizing its debt to make repayment of interest easier. That will mean resorting to the printing presses. And, you know, much of the literature about the problem of the debt is there will come a point, perhaps not for another 15 to 20 years, but if the current trajectory is sustained, that there will be a dollar strike by foreigners who will begin to worry that the United States will find it increasingly difficult to fund its debt through interest payments, ordinary interest payments, and will resort to the printing presses. This is a psychological problem rather than a reality problem, but psychology is important in the eyes of creditors.
It just occurred to me to throw in there, I mean, there's an incredible change in terms of war finance, right, in the era that we're talking about. So Korea is 100% paid for by taxes. Vietnam, much less so, and then the recent wars, it's all borrowed, right? It's just an incredible shift in American history that's, I think, worth thinking about. So.
Well, join me again in thanking our panelists. Thank you as an audience. And we'll be coming back together at 1, correct? At 1 o'clock for the next session.
I just wanted to say one thing. Yes, we will reconvene here at 1 o'clock. There are plenty of places to eat on campus if you want to hang around. You will note that we missed one panelist this morning. Margaret O'Mara could not be here, but her essay will appear in the volume that Roger and Mark will be putting together. And I want to thank the panelists again for a terrific job. So we look forward to seeing you back here at 1 o'clock. Thank you very much.